So, some of the things I read about you said you were born, well, let me start this right. This is Tuesday, July 26, 1976. First take of an interview with Carmen, Lucia, 9:30. Some of the things I read about you said that you were born in Italy and came here when you were 2 years old. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, I was born there.
Yeah, and where were you born?
I was born in Calabria.
Probably in the south.
I'm southern.
Southern.
That's why I put it very nicely in the southern situation. It's always a joke.
But you have no memory of you came over here when you were...
50 years after.
And what did your parents do?
Well, my parents couldn't speak English when they came here because Dad, all our relatives that had preceded him, had already been put in a tailor shop in spite of whatever trade they had in Italy. My father was an artist, not an artist, an artist. And he went to the clothing factory and they did speak the language, their language. And that's where I was.
And where was this? You said it wasn't...
Rochester, New York.
Rochester.
We all landed in Rochester, New York. And I'm glad that we didn't land in New York City because we would have thought it over together.
Yeah.
And Rochester is an individual home. And the atmosphere was different. True that we all went to live in the neighborhoods of people who spoke our tongue. Like our parents, they did for us. And that helped a great deal. But we had a better opportunity to grow up than we would have had if we had landed in the ghettos in New York.
Also, so you were born in 1902?
In 1902.
April
3rd, 1902.
April 3rd, 1902. You came here in 1904?
1904, yes.
Okay. You grew up in Rochester then?
Yes.
Went to school there?
Well, I had didn't finish grammar school. I only went as far as the 6th grade from grammar school. And we couldn't afford to continue. There were 14 of us.
14 children in the
I
family?
was the 7th child.
Seventh child.
So, of course, each of us had a helping family.
Right.
Financially.
So you went to work when you were what?
I was 14.
14?
I was home 2 years. I left school when I was 12, and that was due to the fact that I had my first strike. I didn't like the teacher I had, which is a nun in the Sacred Heart School. It was a school for poor Italian children, a parochial school. I asked too many questions that would irritate to the teacher, so I decided one day I had had enough, and I took my tribe of brothers and sisters that were younger than me and brought them home. Well, in those days, in order to go to public schools, and you needed books if your family had property, a little home, we couldn't get our books free. So when it came to buying books for me, I was the oldest one that had to quit. Dad said, you either go back to the Catholic school, you don't go back at all. So I stayed home. At that time, I couldn't go to work before I was 14. And so I was home for 2 years.
So even then you knew your own mind about what you wanted to...
Pardon?
You knew your own mind then about what you
Probably.
wanted. Yeah.
And my father was very strict, but somehow he always had difficulty with me much more than he did with the others. In fact, when we wanted a nickel to go to the show, my older brothers and sisters would push Carmen, go ask Dad, you know how to handle him, for the nickel.
So you started negotiating early.
Yeah, so I started negotiating. Well, I found out his weaknesses. He had a terrific keen sense of humor. If I could find something cute to say to him, he'd enjoy it. So that's how I got it.
So then you said you went to work when you were 14?
Yes.
And was that in the clothing industry?
In the clothing industry, so a machine operator.
Right. And this is what branch? Was this cats or ladies, millinery?
No, it was in the Amalgamated Clothing Workers.
Oh, ACW.
In the men's clothing industry.
Okay. So was your father in the union?
Oh, yes. We had gone through all kinds of family, the entire relationship that were all in the clothing industry had a very bad period while the union was in the process of being organized because there was terrific opposition in the city to the union. That era it was all over the country. And periodically the tailors, including my father and all my relatives, would be out on strike. They never scabbed, one thing I'm glad about. They weren't too keen about being victimized that way, but because it meant hardships for the entire relationship. But at least they were decent enough not to give in. And I think what interested me mostly was, and I knew that it meant that we had to tighten our belts during that period, I used to read or hear stories about picket lines. I was a bit younger even than 12 then, and I'd say to my father, why can't you take me to the picket line? Take me to the picket line. I want to go to the picket line. Well, he didn't care too much to go, but they used to sign them. But one morning he did go, and it happened to be a terrific morning for me because that's what made up my mind that I wanted to do that kind of work, because the pickets jammed against the door. They were trying to get into the plant. And the employer went up on the second floor and he shot into the crowd. It's a very famous case amongst the amalgamated clothing workers. Her name was Ida Braverman. He shot in the crowd and killed a young woman not far from where I was. And when I saw the blood and heard the hysteria of the people and everything, the anger of the people, I was just as furious. I'd have just assumed if I had had a gun gone in myself and got even with the employer. But that made up my mind. I said to my father, I know now what you mean, and when I grow up, I'm going to be an organizer. So there it was.
There it was. Tell me also about your parents when they came over with their. I know there was a lot of unionism among some sections of the Italian workers. There was anarchism. There was radical. There were reactionary. All sorts of different trends among the immigrants. I was wondering.
Mostly anarchistic, but my father didn't have much. My father loved life too much. He had too much sense of humor to get serious about anything like that. He knew about it, but he didn't embrace it. But I had a brother, who the oldest of the children, who worked for the industrial workers of the world. He got interested in that, so the Wobblies. So of course I tagged along with him, bring me, and of course I heard Emma Goldman and all the others. I've forgotten their names now, they're long past my memory. But Emma Goldman was a Rochesterian. I used to go to the labor lyceum. So it got into my blood. I must have either been born with this feeling for the what they call them now, the humanities, or something, and so I pursued it as I went along.
So then you say you first started work at 14 in the men's clothing industry.
Yes, and I became chair lady in Steinblock, and which was as large as Fashion Park in the clothing industry. It used to be quite a big center, clothing center.
Steinblock?
Steinblock Company, yeah.
Do you remember how that's spelled?
Stein, and two names, Block, B-L-O-C. H, it was B-L-O-C-H.
Steinblock Company. And this is from Rochester?
Yes, and I was chair lady of one of the floors, all women. Remember, there were no blacks. In fact, I didn't meet my first black until I went to Atlanta years and years later. Because black people were not permitted in factories in those days. It was lucky they took Italians, because there were prejudices of the new bunch of immigrants kept coming in. And I know that took years and years for Italians to get into Eastman Kodak Company. And so then I became very active in the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and in 1925 I got a call from Abraham Chapman, who is the international vice president, he still is, of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers there.
It's Chapman?
Abraham Chapman.
C-H-A-P-M-A-N.
C-H-A-P-M-A-N. He was quite, he's developed amazingly. In fact, he and I didn't know too much when we both went in, but he had heard they needed an Italian girl in the office who also knew what was favorable to the union, and he needed a secretary. he already had one, but he was losing it. So he asked me to come in and be interviewed. Well, I thought, how could I be a secretary? I didn't have any education, you know. And he said, well, don't worry about it. All you have to learn right now is the typing. The rest you'll learn as you go along. So for a couple of weeks, I went and picked up typing. And it was quite an opportunity for me because I wanted to get out of the tailor factory. I felt that I could do better. And I thought, well, going into the union office is something I've always cherished. And in those times, they used to have locals for every speaking group. Polish local, Lithuanian local, and girls local, Jewish local, Italian local, and different things like that. So it was very interesting, very varied. So I was there until from 1925 to 1930. In the meantime, there was restlessness in the air.
When China, was he the international vice president? It was the international office you went to then, or the local in Rochester?
In Rochester now.
Rochester, okay.
Yeah, he's vice president in the Rochester area.
I see. Okay. I have to ask these things because...
Well, he was. No, I beg your pardon, you're right. He was international, but he wasn't then when he started with me. But later on, he became international vice president. He still is with the Amalgamated Flooring Workers. There was an awakening on the part of the people. The treatment that the IWW had gotten, you know, got into the papers. The wages were very poor. People wanted to be recognized as individuals and treated as such. And there was a stirring in the air, at least I felt there was a stirring in the air, and a need for workers' education.
So this again in the mid-20s? Or
in the mid-20s.
Mid-20s.
It had already started, and I never had an opportunity to get into these things because my father was very strict. We couldn't go out at night, you know. We were just like nuns. Treated like nuns used to be treated years ago. And I wanted to learn something, so I joined the YWCA, which was the nearest I could get. But we happened to have an industrial secretary who also had some of my ideas. And she sponsored all kinds of activities and learning about unions and reciprocating to the colleges that were also interested in learning about unions. So she'd have what we called meetings between the college girls and the factory girls. Then I heard about Bryn Mawr Summer School.
Bryn Mawr, sure, big school.
Hilda Smith, whom I still adore, she's very ill right now, was the dean of Bryn Mawr, and she conceived it. She had been in Germany, and she had seen that there was educational work being done regarding the growth of organized labor. And she thought maybe that's a waste. She thought it was really a waste to keep the universities closed during the summer when they could be utilized for educational work for workers who didn't have the opportunity of going to school. So in 1927, 1930, 2 summers, I went. It used to be for 6 and 8 weeks each time. And during that period, I think it was in 27, I may forget the date sometime, 27 when the Sacco Vanzetti case was exploding in the air and in the conscience of the American people. I was very active in that because my brother was carrying the ball too, or carrying the charge for Sacco Vanzetti in Rochester. And Bryn Mawr got into trouble that time because we got arrested in Philadelphia when we went to one of the rallies. I didn't, but some of the people did. And the next day, there was a great big caption in the newspapers, the Philadelphia papers, Bryn Mawr, a hotbed of radicalism, you know. We weren't wanted in the first place, but then when we hit the front page, it really became very bad. But then, as a result of Bryn Mawr, Hilda Smith then began to think in terms of opening schools or opportunities in other parts, Brookwood College, which later became a little too radical, you know, and in the South, Briarcliff, I think, Briar something, in California. There were 4 or 5 different schools that had been opened up as a result. So the experience in Bryn Mawr was dramatic in that it was my first contact with communists. Oh, I had one of my roommate was a member of the Communist Party, but at the time I didn't know him. And because I became the president of the class that year, all the communists began to work on me, the potential candidate, a potential member. But somehow I didn't bite, while I agreed with some of the principles, because at that time there were red lines all over, and you could see that we were waiting for some kind of a messiah to take us out of the economic disaster we were facing. And while I was sympathetic to some of their ideas, I didn't ever belong. In fact, I wasn't a fellow traveler either.
So this is what, 28, 29?
Yeah, 28, 29. Well, then in 1930, I decided I had had enough of parental interference or guidance, whatever you call. I love my people, they were wonderful. But I felt Dad was a little bit too strict. And I thought, well, if I go back to Rochester for Bryn Mawr, I'll never leave. Because an Italian girl leaving home was like becoming a prostitute, in the eyes of the Italian community. And I thought, I don't like that kind of scandal, or my people to go through an embarrassing period. The best thing for me to do is not to go back.
And you were 28?
When I was 28.
Let me stop for a minute and make sure.
I forgot where I was now.
Well, you're talking about 1930. You decided that you weren't going to go back to Rochester.
So I made some contacts in the school that the neckwear workers in New York City were looking for organizers.
Neckwear workers?
Uh-huh. They were an independent. Yeah. They were an independent union. They were not affiliated with anybody at that particular time except the AFL. But they were not an international. So
it's just a couple of New York City locals then, or?
Well, they had, as I call it, did they have any? New York and New Jersey, I think, were the only ones that were organized at the time. I went to see Louis Fuchs, who was F-U-C-H-S, was the president of the New York Neckwear Workers Union. And he said yes, that they would hire me, but now wait a minute, what happened to 1930? Yeah, was I married or wasn't I married?
I don't know.
Neckwear workers. No, I couldn't have been in 1930. 31 I was married. Okay, so I was sent to New Haven, Connecticut. And there it was a runaway shop. One of these shops that during that period they were running away from unions. These fly-by-night shops, they were called. And people would wake up in the city and they'd find that there's a factory had come in from New York or New Jersey, and that help was needed in these factories. But they had this system that you're only here for 6 weeks on a trial period. After 6 weeks, then we'll pay you. But we won't know until 6 weeks whether you're going to be okay or not. So the union urged me to apply. And it so happened they were nearly all Italian girls anyway, and I would have been just right. So I kept, for about a week, I kept going with my lunch in my hand and my scissors and everything. And they couldn't find an Italian family for me to room with. And I was supposed to be an orphan. Here I had 13 brothers and sisters. And I was hired.
And what was the name of the company, you remember?
Pardon?
What was the name of the company?
I would if I could look in my...
Sure, why don't we bring them in?
Bring them in. Okay.
So you're in New Haven.
So I was hired, and the union had an outside organizer by the name of Rose Sullivan, beautiful Irish girl. Oh, she was a beauty. And she came from Boston. And of course, she and I worked together. I worked inside, and I'd tell her what happened in the shop so she could utilize it, you know. And so one day I get a call from the foreman. Can't think of his name either. And he said, Carmen, he said, we like the way you would learn to work. You look very intelligent. He said, we need someone who's going to help us to find out who's the union representative in this shop. I've always enjoyed that.
Oh, wow.
And I said, well, what do you want me to do? So he said, there's certain things we want you to do. He says, when I give you the signal to go to the ladies' room, you listen to the conversation, then come back and tell me what you hear. I said, but what is it? What's in it for me? Which would be a natural question. Well, your piecework. Make sure that you maintain your average, and we'll take care of you. You know? And I said, well, I don't care so much about money. Although I can use it, but I want to be sure that I'm kept on all the time because I need the work. I am an orphan. They used to call it Little Orphan Annie. And I became, girls all felt so sorry for me. Didn't have a mother, I didn't have a father, I didn't have anybody, nobody loved me. And of course I I made capital of that. You know, I'd shed a few tears sometimes. I think I should have been an actress. And I became very popular. So when I'd go, I'd listen. He'd come back, what did she say? She said they were suspicious of her. They had a right to be suspicious of her. Well, I said, you've got nothing to worry about. Gee, I said to him beforehand, I said, Sam, I got to talk for the union when I listen. Because if I don't talk for the union, then they're afraid that I can't get anything from them. So go ahead. So I'd go back and say, oh, you've got nothing to worry about. Yeah, she's not for the union at all. And then, or if she was against the union, I'd say she was for the union. Then they'd give her hell all day long to make it miserable. So then I'd go back to Rose Sullivan and say, go work on her. They really worked on her. I think you could get her car. Well, this is the way it worked. Then finally it came where they needed somebody. They finally were confronted asked for union recognition. I was still in the shop. I was just at work. And they wanted a committee. So Sam thought, well, Carmen ought to be on that committee. So I was put on the committee representing the company. What worried me is that I couldn't tell the girls, the truth. So when the strike was finally, I worked on the committee, and I didn't work very hard for it, naturally. When the strike was to be called, I was the one delegated to pull the power. In those days, that's the way you used to call the strike. They'd pull the power, shut the power off, and say, everybody out. And lo and behold, Sam, I thought he dropped dead. When he saw he pulled the power, and everybody out. And the mistake that was made in that strike, and by the way, I'll never forget the day of the strike. It was in winter. And in those days, in New Haven, bitterly cold, and you couldn't even get the windshield wipers to work. It was the frost. So they used to put candles inside to keep the frost from hiding the view. We found one of the strikers had a place right opposite the shop, which we immediately we used it. I said, we'll pay you for the use of the place, and we got chairs and everything. It was ideal, right across the street. The pickets could go and get warm and come back, and we had a soup kitchen right away. I organized a soup kitchen. The strike lasted, was a very bitter, long strike. The strike lasted from January, February. No, it was February the 4th. It was a holiday. I don't remember. It was his 4th, Lincoln's birthday. That was it. Lincoln's birthday.
21st.
No, 12th.
12th, right.
Yeah. 12th of February, 1930. and it lasted until the day before Thanksgiving. The reason for that was that the neckwear workers felt that they had to make an example of this man who had left New York. And they really raised money. They were old-time workers in the factories who came from Europe, who had a certain amount of idealism and were willing to sacrifice some of their small pay to keep this strike going. And we had arrests of all kinds, and I know I was arrested any number of times because I used to get the cop's coat, which I learned later on to handle them differently, but then I used to berate them, brass buttons, blue coat, can't catch a penny to gold. I'd go, and I was young, and you can imagine they'd get so irritated they could skin me alive.
Brass buttons?
Brass buttons, blue coat, can't catch a nanny goat. I was pretty quick on the trigger on everything. And they used to whistle. Da-dum, 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 da-dum.
Scabs go in, the scabs go out. Right.
Yeah. So I was arrested about 10 times in one day alone, because as soon as I was released, I'd go back on the picket line, I'd start all over again. You can't keep me in. The union will get me out, which was ridiculous because of the union money, but I enjoyed it. Then I was in charge of giving the strike benefits out every week. I don't remember what we paid, $7 a week, maybe $5 a week, I don't remember now. And the money was running out, and the strike, the shop got full of scabs. There were 350 strikers out. There's a lot of people in those days, and they had to give it up. So I had the dirty job of telling people that this is no more, sorry, couldn't get the people back. And we didn't even have a break in the ranks of the people. There we had a very peculiar situation. We had families that were torn apart as a result of the strike. People who stayed in, and maybe the mother'd stay in, the children were out, or vice versa, So it tore families apart. Because I remember one incident that there was a family of 3 daughters and a son-in-law, and the mother working in the plant scabbing. I made up my mind I was going to get them in trouble. So I taunt them, when they'd go in. So they decided one day that they had enough of my taunting, so they started to wipe the floor with me, the ground with me. And the police came, and I was being beaten up by the family. Not too bad. And they had me arrested. And I said, she started, I want her arrested. So, first the mother alone. They picked up the mother. She started. So I said to the girls, you're not going to let your mother go alone to jail, are you? And the reason for that is Rose Sullivan, who, by the way, was spearheaded the whole thing. She was the brains on the outside. She was marvelous. Had a friend that came in from Boston one day, and just a friend, not connected with the movement at all. And she was on the picket line. That night she was arrested, and as she was getting into the patrol wagon, her friend said to her, I don't want you to go alone, I'll come along with you. We'll come along with you. And when they got there, both of them were booked. And the cops said to her, anybody that comes out of the patrol wagon is automatically booked. So I said to the girls, you're not going to let your mother go alone. So I wouldn't let my mother go alone to jail. So one of them said, I'll go. And I suppose as long as you're going to go, I'll go. So the son-in-law got in, so the whole 5 of them got in the patrol wagon with me. When we got there, we were all booked, as I had expected. And they were going to put me in the same cell. I said, oh, no, you're not. You're going to come in a private cell, not with the family. And, anyway, we were they had to raise, they had more difficulty. I was out before they were, because they had to raise money for bonds for 5 people, and the union got me out in no time.
So this is 1931 now, in the middle of the Depression.
Well, the Depression wasn't really over. You say it was over?
In the middle. The worst part, actually.
Oh, no, because, wait a minute, no, because I'm coming to that later.
One thing, did you get help from the community? I mean, with the...
Yeah, well, that's what a part. We also established contact with the Divinity School in Yale, because we heard that Reverend Ladd, now why that name sticks with me, Reverend Ladd and his wife were considered, sort of pink socialists,
I've heard the name.
Have you? And we went, and Rose was wonderful for that sort of thing. She was beautiful, and she was Irish, and, she made the contacts very nice. And we had a little Italian girl who looked like she had a striker, looked like she had never had a square meal in her life. We used to use her as our exhibit A. And she had told her story so pathetically. All week on ties and maybe earn $5 more or something like that. So she used to tell that story. Though we had those women, prominent women, really crying. And one day, finally Rose got them on the picket line. So we told our girls in the morning we can call the scabs all the names we want. But at night when the nice ladies, that's what we used, nice ladies come, you behave. Well, what happened when we called names in the morning, they were mad all day long. They couldn't wait till they got out, and they thought if they ever start with us, we'll give it to them. So they came out mad, and they'd start to fight. So we said, see, that's what we got to put up. And we got arrested, and the wife of the president of the Chamber of Commerce, I don't remember her name, was arrested along with us. You can imagine what when she got out of the patrol wagon and she told her name.
Oh, yeah.
The sergeant said, "You're kidding." He said, "No, I'm not." He said, "You're kidding. I'm not going to believe it." And he didn't believe it. He booked it. I don't know what happened to him, but he certainly had a hard time. Well, we got some good publicity then, but we did. The Divinity School students used to come on the picket line and help us, and we got quite a bit of help, but not enough. There was no money, and we try to get as many people back as possible. But by that time, that's what I wanted to tell you. I was supposed to have been married. When I left Rochester, my husband had been with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers as a secretary, financial secretary, or head of the office. I don't think he was a financial secretary, he was just head of the office. They had a big office because they had a big organization in those days. And he had gone to New York. He had quit and gone to New York. And I was supposed to have been married every weekend. I'd say as soon as the strike is over, I'll come to New York and marry him. Because he happened to be a divorced man, and my people, being Catholic, that's probably one reason why I didn't want to go back to Rochester too, aside from other factors. And so the pickets got tired of hearing me say, next weekend I'm going to get married, next weekend. And so one time they picked me up bodily on a Friday afternoon, put me on the train, and decided that I ought to get married. That's all there's to it. The strike is lasting too long. And that's when Rose Sullivan's incident happened, and when I heard about it, that I thought I'd use it when I come back. So that was 1930. The strike was lost. We couldn't get the people back, and I left. Now, where did I go next? Oh, in the meantime, I was married.
Right.
And
okay. And your husband's name was?
Leo Kowski.
How do you spell it? Like?
Kowski.
Polish?
Polish. German Polish. German line, the border line. Of course, he was American born. His father and mother were from there. They spoke German. He didn't speak Polish. Funny part is that they spoke German. Where was I? New York. After New York. So, of course, I know soon after I went to Philadelphia. No, I already had the baby then. No, I didn't. I thought I'd remember all that. The baby was born in 52. No, in 32, excuse me, 32. But what happened was that I went to work for the amalgamate. I was married, and I was looking for a job. No, Ken, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah. Why don't we pick the story up where we remember it, and later on we can go back and forth.
Yeah, well, anyway, in one period I was between 1930 and 34. I had to continue working because even though after I got my baby, I had to go to work because my husband was very, very ill. He had a tubercular kidney, and they didn't know it was tubercular at the time, and all they do was take the kidney out, clean it, and put it back, you know, and a few months later he was back in the hospital. So during all that period, and in the meantime I was pregnant. So we didn't have a suit to our name, you know, and I had to register for some relief or other, you know. And I know it would break my people's heart. The Italians were very proud in those days. Getting on relief was the last thing. I think to a certain extent they still are, a certain portion.
And where were you living then?
I was living in New York. New York, yeah. To go back to Rochester. And so I knew I had to go back to work, even though the baby was only an infant, a few weeks old. We needed money. My people would come from Rochester and help me all they could, you know. Every time one of them would come for a visit, they'd leave some money in a drawer or something like that. They didn't want to embarrass me by giving me money. By that time, the bread lines were notoriously long. Oh, it was awful. Now, this was already 31, and to 32. And I had to stand in line, pregnant and big as I was, from 8 o'clock in the morning, maybe sooner. And the first day, I waited and waited, and by the time it got to 5 o'clock, I was getting apprehensive because at 5 they closed, you know. And I didn't make it the first day. So the next day I went a little bit earlier, and I finally got registered. Then before they give you any relief, they'd come and investigate. Well, we had only been married a short time. My things were fairly clean and new, and I always kept a neat home, you know. But the fact that we had a telephone in the house deprived us of getting relief. I said, well, look, my husband is in the hospital. I'm pregnant. I'm alone. If anything happened to me, at least I could call, you know. I need that very badly. You know? You have the telephone, you're not eligible. Well, anyway, I filled it, and I finally got on. And what did they give you? They gave you food that had been in the warehouses for years, you know. Some of it wasn't even fit to be eaten. They cleaned out all the bins of all this food that sometimes we sent to Europe, you know, or at least we used to. And people complained so much that it was not fit to be eaten. So they decided meantime, Roosevelt and the NRA was being started and so forth and so on. And he was the one that ordered some relief and money. And we got the sum of $3 a week to keep us in food. And, you know, of course, they practically giving the food away in those days because bread was 5 cents a loaf or something like that. Well, anyway, make a long story short, we decided to. I was sent to Chicago by the Negro workers. I had to go wherever they sent me, in spite of the fact that I had this little child. You know, and my husband was ill anyway; he couldn't work, so he took care of the baby while I was gone. And we had a general strike of the Negro workers in Philadelphia. That was in 34. By that time, Section 7A of the NRA which gave the workers the right to belong to the union for the first time in the history of organized labor. And folks from the neckwear workers called a strike of every neckwear plant in Philadelphia, and there was quite a number of them, and I was assigned to take care of the picket lines from one place to another. And I remember one morning, one picket line, about 200, 300 people were arrested because we had formed a daisy chain around the plant.
Just holding hands around the plant?
Holding hands, we wouldn't let anybody in. So they hurled us into patrol wagons, and they filled up the jails with girls, screaming girls, you know, and I had taught them all the Union songs, you know, you could hear them sing, I could still hear them sing. And they got so tired of us, you know, singing that they finally, I don't know whether the Union got us out or not, I don't remember. I know we got out, but we were in there almost all day. If you can imagine, even the flushing, the toilets flush automatically. And some girls used to be astride standing up, you know, and they'd forget, they'd get excited, and their foot would go in. Anyway, they screamed bloody murder, and then we'd rattle all kinds of things against the bars, you know. We made it very, very tough.
So tell me one thing though, when you worked in Rochester, you were working still with Italian women, and then again.
Oh no, in Rochester I was with the amalgamated clothing.
Well, no, the women, but the workers were mostly women and mostly Italian.
Oh yes, yeah.
And again in New Haven.
Yeah.
But how about in Philadelphia now? Was this new?
We had mostly women.
Mostly
And very few men, and mostly in key positions. They were the elite, the cutters.
Right,
They
cutters.
were always the elite of the, and they never very seldom came out. They did, it would be a miracle.
Were these Italian? Were the women Italian or?
Well, not always Italian. Where, in Philadelphia?
Philadelphia.
No, they were a mixed group.
Mixed
group. Very mixed group. I remember one old lady that wore sneakers, and her heels were. And then we finally, in the picket line, it was hot as hell, you know. Philadelphia could be very muggy. And she wore sneakers, and sneakers rubbed on her heel, it would bleed, you know.
Yeah.
I remember little incidents. They were very big to me in those days. And what happened was that we got some kind of an agreement, but it was a very innocuous agreement. I didn't like it one bit. From there I came back I went to Chicago, also for the neckwear workers. Neckwear workers, yeah.
Was it still on 34 or?
Around 34, yeah, 33, 34, somewhere around there. And unfortunately, the Chicago woman didn't like me as soon as I arrived. Didn't like my freshness, I guess. And she made it very difficult for me. And I went on the picket line one day, and the pickets were standing in a corner with their signs, but not picketing. So I went there and asked, "What's the matter? Why aren't you picketing?" "Oh, that cop over there, he's a mean bastard, you know." And I said, "Oh, come on, you have a legal right to picket as long as you picket and you don't bother anybody. We can't do anything to you. That's what you think." I said, "All right, give me the sign, I'll go." I thought if I take it and shame, they'll come. They didn't. They knew better than I did. And when the scabs came out, now what could one person, a woman, do with a sign? The police were all over. But the police were in my way. They had formed a cordon for the scabs to come through, you know. And I decided, well, they're not going to keep me from going through. I said, "Excuse me, I got a picket." So I did that. It was a hero. I was foolish. I would never have attacked her. I put my hand on her and said, "Listen, honey, I want to talk to you." As soon as my hand touched her shoulder, I don't know what happened. A ton of bricks fell on me. I was severely beaten.
By the cops?
By the cops. Taken in an alley. And if I hadn't had a big fur collar on my coat, he'd have bashed my brains out. He was that mad. Because he got mad when I defied the fact I couldn't get the girls back. Anyway, I tried to get the girls back, and I couldn't succeed, and thought, well, I'll teach her a lesson. What I found out was that the woman had forgotten, the organizer, had forgotten to pay the cops that day. In those days, that you had to grease their palms in order to leave you alone, you know, especially in Chicago. And so they really beat me, and they called the patrol wagon as they were getting in. I said to him, "You wouldn't do that to Al Capone, you son of a so-and-so." I said, you know. And gave me a kick right into my spine and pushed me. And the policeman said, "Don't talk to him, wait, he's awfully mean." He said, "You'll only hurt yourself." So when I got to the police station, it was the first time that I really began to feel the pain. He had pulled my arm out of my socket. I was bleeding from the mouth. I was bleeding from several places. And that's when I was too angry to feel pain at the time, but when I cooled up a little bit, I found that I was hurt. So the matron said, "I'll call the doctor." When the doctor came, he said, "Who did this to you?" Because, you know, she wanted to strip me like they treat prostitutes and give me a bath and all that sort of stuff. I said, "Over my dead body, if you touch me, I'll kick you." And so she saw that I was really hurt. She called the doctor, and he said, "Who did this to you?" I said, "The sergeant on the line." And he knew I wasn't a prostitute, or at least he thought I wasn't. And he said, "Well, I'm not going to fix that arm. I want your union." He said, "You're going to be bailed out soon?" I said, "I hope so." I was in terrible agony. But because I want your union to use that against that policeman. We have too many complaints against that sergeant on the line. So finally they found what station I was in, and they came and got me out, brought me to the hospital. And how they yanked the arm to put it back in the socket. I've never forgotten that pain as long as I've lived. And anyway, the girl she felt terrible. The girl whose arm I had laid the hand on felt very bad as a result. She saw the beating I got. I understood that she went the next day, she went and got the girls to go and join the union. She said anybody that could be beaten up like that for the sake of trying to help us should be rewarded or something to that. Anyway, I heard the beating was worthwhile. We got shot in the union. Now, where did I go from there? Then I had an accident in Chicago. Greyhound bus hit me. And that was my fault. And I didn't have a suit to my name. In the meantime, this woman was vicious, the union organizer there. She was jealous. She was so afraid I was going to take her job, you know. I don't know what she'd tell folks, and they decided to drop me. I didn't have a penny to come back to with, and the union didn't pay me anything, but the labor movement, the Jewish labor movement, had heard about it. I had already addressed their group once.
What, the Workmen's Circle?
The Workmen's Circle.
Workmen's Circle.
Yeah. Right. They've always been my friends. And the Workmen's Circle heard about it. They raised the money to pay my expenses back home. So I vowed to my husband that I'd never have anything to do with the labor movement again, you know. Never. They could do that to a person who was injured in behalf of the work, you know. So, but then I had to go back to work. So I got work with the WPA at Workers' Education or something. It was rather vague. And it was at 60 Center Street was the office. But it was a federal educational program. But I didn't last more than 3 weeks because the man who was in charge was a little fresh, and so I had to quit.
Fresh with you?
Yeah. And he passes at me, made my life unpleasant. One day I was walking on Union Square, and I met someone from the Amalgamated Coaling Workers, who was a vice president. He was head of the Shirt Workers Union. And he said, "What have you been? We missed you. We liked you. We used to come to Rochester quite often." I told him all that had happened. He says, well, you can come with us. He says, I'm looking for a girl. Um, Am I getting him? No, I'm looking for a girl because we got an employer who has 3 shops, one in Albany, one in Troy, and one in Kingston. We need 3 organizers, one for each place. And you fit in Albany very nicely. It would make it easy for you to come and see your family, once in a while. So he hired me, even though I had left the Amalgamated with a little bit of a sting. They didn't like why I didn't come back after they had given me the job in Rochester, so they were a little bit disappointed. Anyway, I got in with the Amalgamated, and my husband was still ill, so he stayed and took care of the child. And they sent me to Albany, New York.
Now, remember what year that was? I think there's something marked Albany here.
Is there?
Hang on. Buffalo Town, Albany.
I know I got it stuck somewhere, because I got pictures of.
No,
That's Richmond. Norwalk.
I thought I saw it at Albany. No,
I don't know what.
Buffalo one.
Atlanta. Buffalo. There's another time I was arrested.
How many times have you been arrested?
I don't know. Cattle building line. Year was that? 1938. Well, where are we now? What year?
Well, I don't know,
Oh, 31?
34, 30, something like that. When you were sent to Albany.
It might be. See, the neckwear, so we,
So the ACW, the Amalgamated Center of Albany.
yes, too, and I was in charge of the Albany situation, and there again, this was another runaway shop from New York, and the Amalgamated was interested in organizing the 3 plants at one time. That's why they started the campaign in all 3 places. And we had so much happening there. It's funny, I can't reflect very often. Because we had mass arrests, and we had the Amalgamated came in, Patufsky came in to settle, and it was during the NRA when the minimum wage had gone, a federal minimum had tentatively gone into effect of $13 a week. They were working on industry minimums, but pending the result of the minimum industries, they inaugurated the $13 a week. We had a strike there for quite some time, 6 or 7 weeks, maybe longer. And they were called on in all 3 places, Albany, Troy, and Kingston. So it was very effective. We had the 3 shops closed down tight. Nothing was moving. They were finding it hard to get to strike breakers. And so it looked like we had pretty good control. Along comes Patufsky and a committee, and I wasn't invited for negotiations. I didn't participate, but I think that they had their meetings in New York. They settled it in New York. Well, I didn't like the settlement. I think they got an increase of something like 26 cents a week. And union recognition, well, I've never belittled union recognition as such, providing it was a closed union shop. But we didn't even get a closed union shop. So They went, I don't know why, maybe they didn't trust me. They went first to Troy, and the girl there, Frida, who was full of fun and ridiculous and everything else, she engineered a party, and she ordered beer and sandwiches and everything. And they had the meeting. I wasn't present, but I heard about it. And they accepted it. They went to, did I say Troy?
Yeah.
And then Kingston. And they did the same thing. Whoever was in charge there, they did the same thing. They accepted it. So my place was the third one. I had said to the girls, now, if you don't like what they proposed, they didn't tell me what had happened in the other two. I learned afterwards. I said, you don't have to take it, you know. You can get up and protest or voice your opinion. Well, they took me literally. And it was lousy anyway. It was terrible. And so Potowski sweated blood. And he said to me, why didn't you get your people ready to make a motion to accept? I said, well, if you ask me, I think it stinks. I'm glad that they're not taking it. Well, anyway, he wore the people down. They must have been at it for about 6 hours before they finally consented to accept it. Well, you know what happened then. 2 weeks later, I got a little slip in my envelope that I was no longer needed, that the work was done. I was no longer needed. That was my second bout with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers.
What did you think of Potowski?
Of who?
Yeah.
Potowski?
Yeah, as a leader, as a...
Well, I lost all respect for the Amalgamated, the way they treated me, because I didn't go through the whole story of what happened in Rochester, you know. It was a stinking situation. It was a wonderful union, don't misunderstand me. When they first started out, I was so proud of them. They had a preamble of the class struggle in their preamble, you know, and everything, and of course it was right up my tree, you know. But little by little, while I was in Rochester, dissension began to grow. You don't mind my going back, do you?
No, good.
Going back. Dissension...
As we go on, I begin to see where the holes are in the story, and I can ask questions, and we can go back and figure it out. So let's do it.
Well, if they amalgamated in Rochester, because they had all these speaking locals. The Italian local was the biggest local of them all. And they were fighting for proportional representation, because no matter how, you know, they had two-thirds of the membership were Italians. So the women's local had two delegates, and each one had 2 delegates at the joint board,
right,
represented in the joint board. Well, the others were more or less controlled by, because they were small, controlled by an administration. Well, I was Chapman's secretary at the time, and when
Let's get this name right. Chapman,
Chapman.
C-H-A-T-M-A-N.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And the people would come the next day, if there was a meeting, and they'd take the floor. They'd come practically crying. I lost my job. Wonder what happened. Well, the company told us that they got a call from the union they shouldn't have put me back to work. I said, what happened? Well, we had a meeting last night, and I expressed an opinion. Well, this happened over and over again. Not only did they deprive them of a job, but they kept it on for so long until people, you know, began to feel, what kind of a union is this? You can't even express your mind without penalizing me and the whole family, or their livelihood was at stake. So I began to be very active. And I suppose there was a certain amount of nationalism involved too. They happened to be Italians, and they could pour their heart out in Italian to me, and so forth. So I began to answer them. Why don't you do something about it, you know? So it got to the point where apparently Chapman got a hold of all my attitude, and then when I was a member of the women's local, I get up and express an opinion too. Well, maybe it wasn't right. After all, I was a secretary. The least I could do is keep quiet and not say anything. But I didn't like it. And the result was that they made up their mind that they were going to get rid of me. But they were afraid to get rid of me because I was an Italian, would give the Italians next year. So they froze me out. Little by little, they gave me less and less work. I used to have, and then did the switchboard as well, and they got rid of the switchboard and the individual homes, and I wasn't given any work. I just would hang around and had no, so I just up and quit. So that was the story. So when I got burnt the second time with the amalgamate, I deserved it, because I shouldn't have gone back in this place. Well, anyway, now what am I now?
Well, you just got bounced out of the ACW amalgamated after the Albany.
Albany? Yeah.
But what happened? So they eventually voted for the women.
They voted for it naturally, and I found I was out of a job. By that time, that's when I was pregnant anyway, so it didn't matter. So if I was pregnant, it must have been, and my daughter was born in 32. Must have been 31, I don't know. Maybe I'm getting mixed up with
Yeah,
later.
how many children have you got?
Only got one.
Only got one.
I couldn't have been, didn't have time for any more.
But when you were in, I hope so. When you were in Chicago, was that after your baby was born?
Yeah, my baby was.
Okay, so must have first Albany, then Chicago. How many babies can you have?
No, it must have been after. Wait a minute. Chicago must have come after. I went with the Nectar workers. No, I was with the Nectar workers. I know I was with them.